This is part 4 of our 4-week journey into the Virgin. We've explored the history of the virgin body, the Hyman Maneuver, as I call it, the virgin mind, and how false virtue impacts the virgin heart, which wants to love but is often tarred by shame and guilt over anything sexual in nature. In this final chapter, we open up to explore the virgin spirit, and we welcome 2 iconic names to help us on this journey. We often use this term casually. He or she wrote the book on such and such. But in this case, we mean it quite literally. Our guest wrote the book, Virgin, The Untouched History, which is a provocative exploration of the complex concept of virginity throughout human history. We welcome historian, writer, and editor Hanne Blank Boyd to VIRGIN.BEAUTY.B. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. We are also blessed to have a woman who grew up in the Yukon and still lives there, of what she called years in a field of geology and a First Nations lands claimed negotiator before studying at the Vancouver Film School in British Columbia and the International School of Analytical Psychology in Zurich, which led to her writing a very enlightening book, The Virgin's Promise. Welcome, Kim Hudson, to VIRGIN.BEAUTY.B.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Fantastic. Now, I thought we might start this conversation, Hanne, where your book ends, basically. Quote, virginity is still a meaningful term, and the sexual status it indicates is still important. But what really caught my attention was your mention of virginity as a development phase, redefining virginity from a one-time sexual debut to a lifetime shift from one sexual status to another. The continual acquisition of carnal knowledge, a process of encompassing the physical, emotional, and intellectual and psychological essence. What have you learned since writing that piece in your book?
I think the most salient thing I've learned since writing that book is that there are a lot of people who disagree with me. I have had a lot of fascinating arguments, disagreements about virginity and its meanings with people because they've read the book. You know, they were attracted to the, oh, here's this book about this topic that I'm interested in. Let me read it. And then, many people have reached out to me over, since the book came out back in 2007, and to say, hey, I read your book, loved it, hated it, whatever. But often I really disagree with this thing you said, which is always fascinating to me, because it's one of the deep issues that I deal with in the book is that this is not a firm history. This isn't the history of the nation of Canada. It's not well documented. We have a lot of disparate documents from a lot of different places. A lot of it isn't documented at all. A lot of it is really a lot of what we know about virginity really only exists in the experience of individual people who are talking from a very subjective point of view. And so inevitably, there are going to be just an enormous number of opinions and takes and beliefs, and especially experiences. And when it comes to virginity, I think experiences are some of the most important information that we have, because it's a human quality, it's a human experience. And so, of course, what humans experience and believe and come to think through their experience is going to be critical to what we can understand and what we can know about this.
It's interesting because I believe that you came into this project with a mindset that was dispelled, opened, exploded, became something greater than what you even expected. So it's interesting now that this avalanche of response probably touches on a lot of what it is, how you started with this project.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I am trained as a historian of medicine and as a bioethicist. And so my tendency is to go to the historical record, look at what's there, and see what it tells me. And I know as a historian that anytime I go to the historical record, there's a really good chance that I'm going to find things I haven't run into before, and information and ideas that are going to explode my preconceived notions. And I'm grateful to have had that training, because had I not had that training, working on this book would have been really difficult.
Can you outline for us, Hanne, so our listeners can get a better understanding of like maybe some of like your core findings in that book, and if you're comfortable to share either like what people's reservations were, things like that. I would just love to hear kind of a little bit of a dive into the findings.
Yeah, so the book got its start because I was doing a lot of work in sex education for young adults. And not real surprisingly, one of the questions that I got a lot from, people between the ages of about 13 and 20 was, I did such and so with my partner, am I still a virgin? And they were looking to me for some kind of definition that they could base their self-understanding on. And so, being a medical historian, I trotted off to the nearest medical library, which happened to be Harvard's Countway Medical Library at the time, and thought, well, I'll go and I'll look it up and I'll find out what the official definition is, and that way I can go back to these young people that I'm working with and say, okay, so here's the official definition. Do with it as you will. And as it turns out, you can walk into any major medical library, and I've tried this in a number of them, and find zero definitions of virginity, that was the initial shock to me, was discovering that this supposedly diagnosable, identifiable, supposedly physical state, or at least a state that has this long history of being believed to have a physical, sort of clinical existence, is not something that medical professionals were willing to actually come out and try to define. How weird is that? And when you see that kind of reticence to define something that some doctors claim they can diagnose, you've got an information problem. You've got an information authority problem. Who is getting their information from where? What are they basing it on? How can we back that up? Or is it backed up? Or are we just talking about a bunch of mostly guys in white coats saying, well, I have a white coat and these letters after my name, and that gives me the authority to say what's what. So this already, we're already in the soup, right off the bat, just trying to find a definition. And so this book really began as a search for a definition, any definition that seemed like it hadn't just sort of been gathered at somewhat of an arbitrary basis. And that was the first part too, where my mind was comprehensively blown. Because I was looking for this in the 2000s, and I knew that there had been a big explosion of literature on sexual abuse and child sexual abuse in the 1980s and 1990s, and a lot of research literature, because these became really hot button legal issues and societal issues. And when things become hot button legal issues, we start looking for standards of evidence. And judges and lawyers start looking for standards of evidence. And that means that they're turning to, for instance, gynecologists and pediatric gynecologists and forensic gynecologists and saying, okay, so tell us what we need to know so that we can adjudicate these cases. And so I was reading through this literature and discovering that over and over again, what these doctors, what these physicians were doing was saying, I can't give you that answer. That evidence doesn't exist. We don't have the physical evidence to give you the juridical standards, the evidentiary standards that you're asking for. And that really fascinated me, because what that usually tells you, and I'm speaking of my medical historian hat on, when doctors admit that they really can't prove something, they mean it. Like, we really can't prove something. And you could tell by the way that some of these physicians were writing that they believed that this was a thing. They believed that virginity existed, but they did not have the means to pinpoint what it was. And so they were offering some kind of interestingly vague, but also sometimes vaguely interesting explanations. And I think the one doctor whose writing really hit me was a doctor who had done a lot of longitudinal work on girls and young women who had been survivors of sexual abuse and penetrative sexual abuse. And he had looked at their bodies and looked at their anatomy over a period of some years from the time of first report into the future. And what he said, and this is J.M. Paradise, he said, it's normal to be normal. And that most of the bodies that he was looking at sort of fell somewhere in this bell curve of what looks pretty normal for young women's bodies, regardless of what had happened to them. And I found that really moving in a way, because that's a lot of humility for a physician to show. They're not trained for that kind of humility. But also really moving in that it says so much about the body and the resilience of the body and the capacity of the human body to withstand assault, which may have long-term consequences. I'm not meaning to minimize it in any way. I think any kind of assault can be, can completely change your life. I won't say destroy, but completely change your life. But the body is incredibly resilient. And the good thing is that means that there's a lot of resilience to be had and to be depended upon there. The flip side of that is when we're talking about virginity, people often really want there to be some sort of physical, so almost like an archaeological record in the body, right? They want there to be something tangible where they can say, this happened and this is how it changed my actual physical person. And that's tricky. That's really tricky.
It's impossible because not every body is the same. So how do you definitively use that as a guide? Really?
Yeah, well, in my view, just coming from my perspective as somebody who looks at medicine as a field, you don't. And so when you have to rule out the body as a diagnostic, then it opens up a bunch of other doors. Right. So if this thing exists, and I think that, largely speaking, people will say, yes, we think that this is a thing, that virginity does exist. Okay, so then what is it?
Yeah.
And that's actually a way more interesting question than does the body do X or Y? Because that's a pretty open and shut thing. In fact, when I started working on this book and people would say, oh, what are you working on? And I would say, oh, yeah, I'm writing a book on the history of virginity. People would say, oh, that's going to be a short book. Because they all did assume that it was just going to be there was going to be a clinical history and there was going to be a definition and that was going to be the end of the story. Turns out that the original manuscript for this book was 1,000 pages. Wow. My publishers very sensibly said, nobody is going to buy a doorstop. Please shorten. And I did, but there's so much to say, and there's so much, of course, that that I couldn't fit between one set of covers because we're not just looking at a physical diagnosis.
Which, Kim, that's where you come in, right? It's beyond the physical. Can you maybe give us a bit of your backstory as to how this became a topic and how you now see virginity and how you used it in your writing?
Boy, the story of getting here, there's something I'm not sure I've tracked, but let me start with how I see virginity. I started actually with the Jungian idea, which is that it's about a relationship to self. And it's interesting because we don't have another word for that, because if there was, I probably would have used it in my book. Because I come up against this all the time, where people, and usually women are offended by the word virgin. Men seem to be a lot more comfortable with it, even though I see it as gender neutral. But what I've come to understand, and what I like sort of the best, is this moment where we know the word virgin as in a virgin forest, which means that you know the forest to be of value just for being itself. And that being a virgin is actually a state of mind that we awaken to, which is where we become internally referencing. We allow our own opinion to be what guides us in life, as opposed to being externally referencing, which would be where we're seen as a victim or unpure or all these things. That's a message coming from the outside that we adopt to be true about ourselves. So virgin is this journey to know yourself and be yourself, to allow your own opinion to be the one that matters to you. And it actually, we're born very dependent on those around us, and we learn to absorb what our environment tells us and to engage people by our behavior being something that's compatible with them. And maturity, or I think you did say that it's a developmental stage, is this point where we learn to actually turn the camera around and decide who we are and how we want to bring ourselves into the world. And things like rape is basically, on my level, telling you that you are very low value, that it's done without reverence. And actually, what's required is this ability, this virgin ability, to say, that's not my opinion. And my opinion of me is what helps me flourish and show up as a whole person in the world. And that's actually the soul of beauty. I do believe that when a person is connected to themselves, there is a mind-body connection, and that starts to radiate from that person, and we as humans can pick that up as beauty. There's a guy, Robert Schenk, I believe, who wrote a book called The Soul of Beauty, and when I read that, I was just like, oh my God, this really is heartwarming. No. So that's essentially my understanding of what virginity is.
Yeah, I think
Or being a virgin, actually. I'm going to say it differently. I think there's a difference, virginity and being a virgin. It's a way of being. It's not something that you do.
Right.
It's wonderful to hear you say that, because we had a lovely guest come in to speak about Jungian, thoughts on the virgin, and exactly as you said. And what a good interlude between virgin to our next part of the series, which was on beauty, because there's so much focus on external beauty. So I'm going to dive definitely into our next series. But what I find really beautiful in the journey that I've been taking with Christopher is that there has been so much shame put on women's sexuality, and that when hearing that word virgin, there's almost a negative visceral response that is clouded or cloaked in so much emotion around how she should have acted or did act, or what that experience was like for her if we are talking about just one moment. But to instead look at what's possible when the virgin, like virginity, the virgin self, is really that untouched part of you, that part that no one else can ever see the way that you do. So the way that you've articulated it here, Kim, it's renewing and refreshing to me. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on how you think that the concept of the virgin, while keeping in mind it as a spirit, a sense of self, how can we use that to help rid women of some of the shame that's been inflicted on their sexual self? Maybe I can start with you, Kim.
I have come to recognize that there's something almost magical about the more we occupy our bodies, that energy of that self, of virgin, grows and comes to your life. or maybe it's like this union that happens. It just has this wonderful feeling of belonging. So I do think that there's something very important about body and this sense of self, this mind state. So I'm sorry, could you ask me the question again? I got lost in my own reverie here. Yeah.
I understand. I totally understand. Just the way that you had described seeing the virgin self.
Oh, yeah.
How do you think that that can help women who have been kind of downtrodden or really experience a lot of shame and guilt around their sexuality?
Yeah. So I think the first part is that we need to notice our reality in that we are feeling shame that something has happened, but also notice our ability to feel joy still. So that there are things that still means, like that remind you and activate that part of yourself and feed yourself with that. We have to regain that connection. It can be literally, I love mac and cheese and I'm going to enjoy that for all it's worth, right? It activates you. It's a body feeling reconnection. And then it's important to recognize that our greatest challenges actually give us our greatest heights as well. Viktor Frankl mentioned this, he was in a concentration camp and couldn't believe that he met somebody, actually had a flutter of love. And it made him realize that the profound thing about being human is that we have a range of feelings and we can choose which ones we want to grow. And we do that by giving it our attention. So you could take a bad experience and use that as the strength of your ability to reconnect to yourself and know that you're of value separate from what other people want. But also to know that you can choose what you're going to grow in yourself and consciously know what brings you joy, what's healing for you, the people around you that nurture you, and allow those messages to come in. Even notice if your own self is blocking, is being not receptive to this idea of your purity or your right to joy and respect, and just really take charge of your internal world. I think that's what it's about.
I love that you brought up Viktor Frankl, one of my all-time favorites. Oh, so wonderful.
Yeah.
So I was thinking in terms of virginity and selfhood. You may not be able to read it because I think my camera is reversing things, but my T-mug says I've got 99 problems and heteronormative white patriarchy is basically all of them. And a student of mine gave me this and I cherish it. But it really makes me think a lot and really sort of resonates a lot for me in thinking about virginity. Historically, one of the reasons that women, when they have been able to, and let's make sure that we give that caveat, when women have been able to choose virginity, one of the reasons that they have chosen it was to get away from the demands of heteronormative patriarchy. When we go all the way back to the ancient world and the first records that we have of women who were able to choose virginity. And what does that mean? Sort of operationally speaking, and in terms of what goes on in your day-to-day life, both outer and inner, I think there's a lot of connection to what Kim is saying. It lets you be your own person, your existence, your day-to-day life, your function in the world, who you are, how you react and interact with other people, where your responsibilities lie, is not determined by a patriarchy that's trying to get you to react to it and respond to it and serve it. And so that, I think, across history is one of the reasons that virgins are so troublesome and troublemakers, and why people have also created stigma around being a virgin when you're not supposed to be a virgin. Because when you're not supposed to be, and notice gigantic air quotes, when you're not supposed to be a virgin and you are, that means that you're still refusing to play the patriarchy's game.
It's true. You're uncontrollable.
You're uncontrollable in a really fundamental way.
Yeah.
And I think that is a piece of virginity that, regardless of what has happened to you or your body and whether or not it was consensual or voluntary, in terms of your sexual history and your sexual experience, I think that that's a really valuable thing to think about, and a really valuable thing to think with. Is, am I self-serving in a good way? Am I serving myself? Am I doing good things? Am I doing well for and by myself? Or am I serving something else? And if so, what is that? And am I doing it on purpose? Right? And if I'm doing it on purpose, what's my reason for doing that? This is not to say that being part of the patriarchy or having, some interests in common with the patriarchy is necessarily a bad thing. Many people do. But you need to have your reasons.
I think you said something really, really interesting there, is that this idea of being self-serving, to be selfish, that's like the worst thing a woman can do. But it's actually our doorway to allowing ourselves to be, our connection to ourselves, to bring that virgin energy forward. So it's almost like that's a hook of patriarchy to say that being selfish or aware and actualized are like bad things, but they're actually the key to being yourself in the world. Now, of course, selfish, it can mean it's not always like good. It can be excessive and that sort of thing, but it's a really important gateway for how we enter in our virgin selves into the world.
Well, you're sort of jumping way ahead in a beautiful way, because when you're saying these things, my envisioning is the worst thing women have been called forever, which is a bitch. It is that selfish or self, my needs are important too, and my opinions are important too. So what are you when you put that face out into the world? You are a bitch, right? But again, that's a space women need to go in order to actually embody and live the kind of freedom that you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. And I would say there, in this virgin world, there is no good and bad. There's just sort of interesting. So if we find ourselves in the world and we have to push harder and be stronger in our opinions, and then that's fair enough. And people may try and control you with this labeling, but you know for yourself, no, this is what it takes, and this is how I get my voice heard. We could also self-reflect and say that I've got unmet needs from my past, and therefore I'm acting that way today to sort of work it out. And in those cases, we take responsibility for taking care of ourselves and to work that out and not necessarily have it reflect on every relationship that we've got. So it's the empowerment of actually choosing that and knowing that what I think is what matters. So I don't have to convince everybody in the room that I'm important or that, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think that something that I would add to that is, again, this is in part, this is a question of the system in which we exist and the sort of the layered structures of power and status and access to resources that we live within, and we all live within them. None of us is completely independent. And calling someone a bitch is one of the ways that people who have control of power, status, and resources, it's one of the ways that you police people who have less in the way of power, status, and resources. And so I think that when we think through virginity and think about this idea of independence, and does being independent and in sort of living in this virgin space, does it make you a bitch? Well, absolutely it does. You're a threat, because you're saying, hey, I have decided to separate myself in a fundamental way from the priorities of this system of power and privilege and resources, and to say, I'm going to negotiate with this system on different terms, which generally systems of power and hierarchies, they don't like that. You're upsetting the apple cart. How dare you, right? So of course they're going to come at you with both barrels blazing.
So I love that word power. And I actually think that there is a difference between masculine power and feminine power. So masculine power is the only one in the dictionary, which is to assert your will even against resistance. And I think when a woman shows strength, they're seeing that as like, okay, well, that's a threat against my ability to assert my will even against resistance. But I would say that the feminine version of power is to know yourself, be yourself, and support others in doing the same, supporting others in knowing themselves and being themselves. And it's this generative form of power.
That's beautiful.
And much more mutualistic.
Yeah.
I tend to think of it as not in gendered terms, but as hierarchical versus lateral. So if you have lateral distributions of power where power is more shared, it doesn't, and one person having power doesn't detract from somebody else having power. That works quite differently than if you have sort of a pyramidal structure where, there can only be one, at the top of the heap, right? And everybody else is a threat.
Yeah. I don't like gender either, like to attach to a gender. I do think there's a masculine and feminine, but even then I prefer to say linear and circular thinking. And then we're all capable of both, and there's actually times when either one of those is useful. So
I think that's a perfect segue for one of the questions we like to ask our guests on this show. And I think, given some of what you've already said here, please, feel free to go in any direction and certainly beyond what traditional means have said. But we like to ask our guests, what does feminine mean to you? Please.
To me, it's feminine is to know yourself and be yourself, separate from what other people expect from you.
I want to add a caveat to that, because in your bio, you said that earlier on in your life, as an archaeologist, you lived
or geologist.
Yes, you lived your life as more of a masculine. Is that correct?
I was much more, the heroic, more, assert your will, overcome obstacles, right or wrong, that type of thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's another valuable form of power. It's just that's masculine. My feminine is my awakening of my internal world and giving it a physical form.
I come to this from, I'm a historian, and everything gets filtered through the history lens. It's an occupational hazard. But it also gets filtered through the fact that as a historian, I know that all histories are relative to other histories. Western history and Western ideas of masculinity and femininity are not the same as histories of masculinity and femininity from other places or even other times. And so I have a really difficult time thinking about femininity or masculinity separate from place and time. Because the things that we associate with masculinity and femininity tend to change and shift from place to place and time to time. There are some big patterns that we see if we look, so we sort of, take that 30,000-foot view of human history. There are some big patterns that we tend to see, often about sort of an internal versus external orientation to the world, with external orientation being often a more masculine orientation and or way of thinking, way of interpreting the world, and an internal being more of a feminine way. But that is very much sort of on a, I won't say archetypal in a Jungian way, but archetypal certainly in that it shows up over and over and over again at some level in lots of different cultures at lots of different times. Where that comes from, I do not try to speculate, because that's above my pay grade. But I think that there is value in recognizing that when we see something appear over and over and over again across the span of human history and cultures, that there's something there that we're reacting to, that humans are reacting to. And I think that that's valuable to note. But I think it's equally valuable to say that wherever you are, whoever you are, whenever you are, is going to shape and color and texture what those words, those gendered terms, can mean in your world, as well as what they mean to you, but also what it's possible for them to mean in the world that you live in.
In this conversation, I get the sense, and I've had this sense for a long time, is that as human beings, we are very, very smart. We're very clever. However, there are concepts, constructs of the universe that we cannot define. We struggle to define them. And these words that we're talking about now, virginity, virgin, feminine, we struggle to define. We believe we know them so well. Like we would swear on a stack of Bibles that we know these words, and we would explain them to our children, and we're right. However, like we're having in this discussion, these words are not definable. They're not something you can hold up and pin to the wall and say, this is what it means.
Yeah, which is kind of what's great about it, in that it's, you know, we can all, it's our quest to understand what it means, that what the real value comes in. I actually think defining things is a masculine quality. You want a box that you can put it in and say, this fits, this doesn't fit. Mm-hmm. But the person that defines it has the power then. And I think in the feminine, we actually are comfortable with the ambiguity. It's a felt experience, and then curious about the variety. We want to be inclusive of everybody's sense of that. And by doing that, we are acting in a feminine milieu. You know, we have activated the feminine just by not requiring a definition.
I like to think of that that we can look for an answer, or we can look for an opportunity to ask another question. And one of the things that I love about the subject of virginity is that it lets you ask so many questions. Mm-hmm. And one of the big questions that I've asked in my work, and that I think a lot of other people have come to ask in their work on virginity is, okay, so we have this idea, we have this word, virginity. What does it let us do?
Right.
What is this doing for us that we have it? You know, what does it let us do? Who can do things with this? What kinds of things have we been able to do? Are they the same things that we can do now? So what possibilities does having this little lever, you know?
Yeah. It's like when you name something, it comes into existence. And now we have something to explore, you know, and that's when we start to recognize the importance of knowing ourselves and bringing that to life, because it's got a word.
I think the shameful part of it is it can also be used as a hammer to hold people in place. I think that's, unfortunately, it's been used that way for so long. And that is why it's become a negative experience for so many people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And again, you know, systems of power look for ways to self-reinforce. And so when you have, you know, virginity being used to shame people, either that you have kept your virginity when you're quote unquote not supposed to, or you have lost your virginity when you're quote unquote not supposed to, who's saying what you're supposed to do? That's the important question, is, well, where does that come from? Who's telling you this? Why are they saying this? Who benefits from you believing the things that they're telling you? And how do they benefit if you believe the things that they're telling you? These are questions my students get very irritated with me when I ask them for the 5 millionth time. Well, who benefits from this? If we do this, who benefits? But it's really true.
And also the question is this for me to decide for myself, or is this for me to be told something that I'm supposed to do?
Yeah.
And who benefits when they get to tell you, right? And how?
Unfortunately, that's the part that brings resentment. I like your story about talking to nuns, Hannah. Like, can you share any of that experience? Talking to nuns about virginity, like my mind blows just the thought of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to several groups of nuns and also consecrated virgins living in the world, which is a special religious status within the Roman Catholic Church. about virginity. And partly what I experienced was that their responses were generational. The older the age of the nuns that I was talking to, the more likely they were to say, you know what, I could take or leave being a virgin, I could take or leave thinking about sex, but I really wanted to be a nun, and this is how you do it. For some of them, it was, I knew that I really didn't want to do the other thing that was available to me, which was to get married and become a mom. So for them, for at least some of them, virginity was just the price of the ticket. And they were fine with that. They had made that choice. They were like, yep, absolutely willing to make that bargain. I talked to some younger women for whom the yearning for virginity and the sort of, sometimes in a deeply personal way, sometimes in a very sort of icon-based way, and this again in a very Catholic context. Sometimes in I want to be like the Virgin Mary, or that, you know, that particular icon of virginity being so appealing to them that they wanted to model their lives after that. And that desire, that admiration, adulation, desire to model their lives after that particular Catholic archetype became the impetus for them to choose a vocation. And then I also encountered some women who were, several of them consecrated virgins living in the world. So they haven't taken orders, they're not in convents, they're certainly not cloistered, they're not terribly numerous, but they're out there doing their thing, where they, some of those women that I talked to had a really interesting and very old, in terms of how Christianity and the church has thought about virginity, way of thinking about it, which was that they conceived of their own virginity as creating a space in their being for God to occupy. And it's a very, very old way. I mean, and when I say old, I'm talking like early church, you know, first 5 centuries of Christianity way of thinking about it. The idea that the body is essentially a vessel for God, and that one of the ways that you can make your body not only a suitable vessel for God, but also to create the space inside your personhood for God, is to not have a sexual existence and to not have those ties or those experiences. And what's fascinating to me about that is that it wasn't about pure or impure or good or bad, but is there space? Because all of these other things that you could be doing with your body or your sexuality, they take up space. And that to me was such a fascinating and utilitarian, in a way to think about it. That I really enjoyed those conversations so much, and just the range of different sort of standpoints on virginity that I got from talking to so many women who had chosen it religiously. Yeah, so since Virgin came out, I have written a couple of other books. I wrote a book that came out a handful of years ago called Straight, The Surprisingly Short History of Heterosexuality, which actually came directly out of my work on Virgin, because I discovered that I was spending all this time talking about heterosexual people and people who identified themselves as heterosexual, and that when I went to go and try to talk to people who were queer identified about virginity, they were like, I'm really not sure how that applies to me. That's an interesting idea, but I don't know what I have to say to you. And so I ended up going down that rabbit hole, and that ultimately led me to write a book on the history of heterosexuality, which is an idea that is about as old as the typewriter and the light bulb. And then most recently in 2020, I wrote a small book on a really big topic, and I say that pun intended, about fat and about the cultural history of fat in the West, and the ways that we have come to understand fat as a stigmatized attribute. And that includes a lot of gender politics and racial politics and class politics And of course, big old heap and helpings of medical history and history of science. So all of those are out there, and I'm currently at work on a book about sort of the organization of the patriarchy called Penises Are Magic, a guide to patriarchy for everybody who didn't consent to it. And which, by the way, is everybody, because we get born into a patriarchy. We weren't asked. We get born into it, and so we have all, been sort of forced into this system. Which, holy crap, we're here now. What?
It's an amazing title.
Thank you. I hope the rest of the book lives up to it. That's all I can say.
I'd buy that on the title alone for sure. It has been a tremendous series. Heather and I are really blessed to have had these conversations with such a variety of women and gathering so much experience into these conversations. I truly hope they're helpful to those listening. If you are at all questioning these concepts and constructs, to help you, open your mind, hopefully, to what things that you may not have thought about this word and where it might lead you moving forward in your life. Hopefully, it gives a little bit of freedom to explore and to grow internally yourself. That's the whole point of all these conversations. And we cannot thank Hanne, we cannot thank Kim, we cannot thank you enough for sharing your tremendous knowledge that you have. It is invaluable, and we are blessed to have had you share that with us. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful to wrap up this series with you two. And wow, it has truly been such a journey. And I hope you listen to the other 3 episodes, because what you've spoke on here, it builds really quite the amazing picture. So thank you for your time and your dedication to this topic.
And you have been listening to
The Virgin series.
The Beauty coming.
And the bitch.
Also down the road. So come on back. Find us, like us, share us. Come on back. Let's talk some more.